I'm an academic associate at the Center of Genomics and Policy here at McGill. So I am going to be presenting the concept of research integrity today, but more specifically focusing on the core values and principles that promote and govern research integrity in all types of research. I know you come from varied backgrounds, and I won't be focusing specifically on medical research. It'll be just research integrity at large, and I'll also be narrowing in on specific policies at McGill because I know most of you are researchers here at McGill University. So as you can see from my title, I have a diverse background in science and also in law. Through this diverse background, I have encountered many situations of questionable ethics or issues with research integrity in the scientific field, in the legal field, in the academic field, and I'd like to know, by raise of hands, who has also encountered such situations in their professional or academic careers. Has anyone had issues with integrity or questioned what their supervisor was deciding or doing throughout a project? Okay, and who is familiar with the concept of research integrity? Have any of you had prior training in this field? So to address these disparities, this workshop will hopefully help fill these gaps and help you understand the importance of research integrity in all types of research. Integrity is specifically a very important topic today as we face questionable integrity with media and current politics. So we can see through different fake newses that have been coming out recently, in the past month even, on climate change being a trick pulled by the Chinese or vaccines causing autism. So these fake news or altered truths can also be found in the scientific context. We can see that there are always a new kind of superfood. There's always this new ingredient that's going to cause cancer. And every month it seems that it seems to be changing. So the scientists don't seem to have their mind made up about these things. As you can see, chocolate is good for us. Chocolate is bad for us. Coffee's good for us. Coffee's bad for us. Different ingredients that when you read one article to the next, you never understand what the true scientific value is. And this results in us as a society not listening anymore. I'm a fanatic of chocolate. I don't even read articles about chocolate because in my brain, I like chocolate, I'm going to eat it. But I don't want to read those articles that say, no, chocolate is bad for you, or yes, chocolate is great for you, because I don't know what to believe anymore. So this leads us to ask ourselves, why don't some members of the public trust scientific facts, scientific theories, especially when there are so many evidences that support these theories, such as climate change? Why do people believe in conspiracy theories? What would you think would explain such a phenomenon? Yes?
Because very rigorous scientific findings are not that marketable. It's not definite, it's not yes or no, it depends on certain circumstances, so it could vary from situation to situation. And I think that that's much more difficult to put in a punchline.
Yeah.
And maybe easier to think. If it's difficult to understand, it's maybe you feel that you shouldn't be understanding it. It leads to doubt.
That's definitely valid, and we see that today. Any other ideas why public just wouldn't trust scientific articles or even relating to politics? Why don't we trust that climate change? Why don't we trust climate change? Or if we do trust it, why do we trust it? Where do you think this trust element comes from? Any ideas?
I think it's come from personal experience. So if they don't feel that there is climate change, they probably don't believe it.
Yeah. Even though there's so much evidence backing it up, do they not trust the evidence? Do they not trust the method it is portrayed in the media? There are also methodological shortcomings, perhaps, that would influence people to not trust the methodology that's behind these facts. There's also maybe possible conflicts of interest that arise with financial interests, with pharmaceutical companies, for example. You never know if you can trust those ties that research studies may have with financial entities. Also, there could be inappropriate statistical analysis that can be seen very often with scientific studies that don't quite portray statistics, or even the public don't quite understand how to interpret the statistics that are portrayed in scientific studies. And there's also little trust for a peer review process. So when you submit an article to a journal, a lot of scientists have little trust for the peer review process. And how do you expect the public to trust scientific articles if even the scientists have difficulty trusting the peer review process, that their own knowledge is coming forward? So through government, media, justice, the justice system, and even scientific articles, we can see that trust is of utmost importance. And unfortunately, mistrust is a consequence of the fake news that is coming about through all these platforms. It is also important to note that it is easier to destroy trust than it is to build it back once it is destroyed. And this applies to all platforms, even including relationships. So this quote can be applied to research integrity as well, whereas you can see that when you talk about trust, you have to take into account the groupthink, how they interact, how they communicate, how they are educated, their roles and relationships, their values, their practices, and behaviors. And this is very relevant for establishing the best practices of research integrity in research. You must first establish a common definition for what is research integrity. And then you must elaborate what the shared values and principles that guide research integrity and best practices. And finally, through sanction, promotion, and prevention, you can implement the values and principles of research integrity. And this is exactly what we will be looking at throughout this workshop. So starting with the definition of research integrity. What do you think composes research integrity? How would you define it? Do you have any yes?
Well, I would say ethics would be a big part of it.
Yeah, definitely.
Doing things in an ethical manner.
Do you have any examples of situations that may arise where unethical practices are used?
In my own research, no.
I can give you one example to help jog your memories about this, that of an unethical practice that is commonly seen in a wide variety of fields is gift authorship. So it's providing authorship to senior researchers, senior members of teams, not because they contributed to the authorship of the paper, but just because having their name on the paper will give a better appearance for the paper, or even they need to because they are their direct supervisors or superiors, so they have to include the name. So this is a practice that is commonly seen throughout many fields, in academia particularly, that is unethical and that does not warrant integrity in the research. Can you think of any other examples? Yes?
There's the extreme cases of fabrication, data fabrication, falsification.
Exactly.
But I guess those aren't clear, but I think there's
No, that's
whole range of, like, maybe not misconduct, but misbehavior.
absolutely, and we'll be covering that throughout this workshop. Can you think of anything else?
I have a question.
Yes?
Actually, I study graduate study at United States before, and I received funds there, and I conduct some research. I haven't published anything yet, but I was wondering if I can publish the research I conduct there. Because I'm not sure, because I'm now in McGill, I'm not sure if I can publish the research I conduct in previous institute and I receive from there.
Yeah, no, I understand. And that is definitely a case-by-case basis. And it's a definite example of research integrity coming into play where you don't know what the ethical and right thing is to do. And in this specific situation, you really need to go back into the contract or grant or award that you were awarded and look at the actual restrictions. So if it specifically restricts you from publishing in another organization, or if it simply says you need to recognize, give them recognition for an acknowledgement for their funding, there are different approaches that can be taken, but it's ambiguous. Research ethics, research integrity is never clear-cut. It's always ambiguous, and that's why it's important to have consultants or research ethics boards, which we will go into later in this talk.
Just one comment about this, at least in our community in engineering. This is very common that there is one affiliation for the person and there is one sentence following that this work has been done while this author was doing research in that institution, and this will resolve the issue of that if this is just about the affiliation.
Yeah, so that would be a form of acknowledgement of the previous funding. So, research integrity is the use of best practices from respecting honesty, accountability, openness, and fairness in all of research practices. And these values are set forth through different institutional policies, guidelines, regulations, and professional and disciplinary standards. So the policies we're going to be looking at in depth today are those of the Tri-Council State Policy Statement, also known as the TCPS-2, and also the Tri-Agency Framework that was recently updated in 2016. So both of these policies are widely used throughout Canada, and they're emitted by the three main agencies in Canada, which are CIHR, Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and CERC, which is the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and SHRC, SSHRC, which is the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. For those of you who may not have a background in law, it is important to note that these are policies, so they don't have binding, they are not binding in nature. However, the researchers who are working under funds from these three agencies, or even researchers who are working under institutions or research groups that reference and implement the TCPS-2 or the Tri-Council framework are, in fact, must comply to the dispositions brought through these policies. And that is widespread throughout Canada. But also specifically at McGill, on top of implementing the two policies that I just presented, they have a separate regulation on the conduct of research. And this enforces the importance of research integrity through mirroring similar dispositions from the policies, such as the principles of honesty, integrity, trust, accountability, and collegiality. So the first step is to identify what values guide and help research integrity come forward. What do you think values would be important to the implementation of research integrity, and why do you think these values would be important? And keep in mind, there's no right or wrong answer. There are so many values that are a plus value to research, but what I'm trying to bring about are the 5 values that are identified as the main values for research integrity. So what values would you think? Just say out loud. Maybe it's important to be honest in research, correct? What else, how else would it be important to implement research integrity?
I suppose that it's somehow, with this honesty, you should have some trust as well in your
Absolutely.
peers.
That's a very pivotal point. Any other? Maybe with this trust, it's important to be transparent.
Yes.
And that's specific to, I can think of just politics. It's important to be transparent, especially today. In science, with methodology, retracing different experiments, being able to verify the experiments. What other value do you think would come about? So these are all valid points, and the 5 main values that are implemented through the various policies in Canada guiding research integrity are that of honesty, fairness, trust, accountability, and openness. So honesty is to be straightforward and free of fraud and deception. Fairness is you must be impartial, using sound judgment, free of prejudice and favoritism. Trust, you must be reliable and trustworthy in interaction, because as we will see later, there are so many trust relationships that establish throughout research, through the many actors that are involved. So trust is very pivotal. Accountability is having to be responsible for your actions and answerable. And openness focuses on transparency. So we will view all these values and how they are actually implemented through best practices in research integrity. So the first value of honesty revolves around the fact that consent must be voluntary. And what is meant by voluntary in this case is that there should be no undue influence, no coercion, and no offer of incentives. So can you think of examples of coercion used in research? Yes?
If the compensation is, well, maybe not coercion, but maybe undue incentives, like the deal is too good to pass up.
Mm-hmm. That's true, and you can see that happens. You'll see later an example of an actual ad placement from a pharmaceutical company in Metro Acadie, and it's exactly a case of an offer of incentive that is, it's too good to pass up, as you say. But we'll visit that later. Any ideas of coercion?
Just question, consent of the researcher or
Consent of the participant.
participants?
Participants.
Okay, so this is
So
you are
researchers
only-
recruiting participants.
Okay, we are focusing on
Yes.
research on human.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, for now. So, any ideas of coercion? How researchers can ask or force participants to take part in their study?
Yeah, if they also, if they would be left off worse than not participating in the study. So if the doctor would say, if you don't participate in the study, I won't treat you anymore.
Yeah, that's, yes?
Coercion could come indirectly, where it's not the researcher who's necessarily doing the coercion. It could be that they deal directly with, let's say, a corporation, and then let's say the CEO says, I want everyone to participate. That becomes a form of coercion, because then the people who work there will feel that they can't say no without having some kind of consequences for their employment.
Absolutely. And this is also seen in an academic setting with teachers, professors, who say, I'm doing this research study, here's the sign-up sheet to be a participant in my study, and just leaving it at the corner of their desk. The students don't know, who probably feel that if they don't sign up for this research study, their grades will be affected. And even if the professor says, oh, well, you won't be affected, but I'll definitely consider this next time I grade you, that's kind of more subtle coercion, where the professor would kind of recruit students that are in a vulnerable position in the teacher-student relationship. So as you were saying, a form of incentive would be this example from Algorithme Pharma, which is at Acadie Metro, where it says everything you can do with the money you're going to be receiving from participating in research. So treating your friends and traveling and all these fun activities, but you have to keep in mind that for research, yes, there are many research studies that provide financial money to the participants. However, you have to see the distinction between incentive and compensation. So compensation is what researchers must do for their participants in case of high time investment and high effort investment. So compensation is truly just paying the participant proportionally to the time and effort they invested. It can't be an incentive to participating in the research, otherwise it would be a form of coercion. And the participant implication would not be so voluntary in that case. This also comes in form of withdrawal. Withdrawal is an important concept to make very clear in the consent form. Here's an example of a section in the MUHC template at McGill University here. So what should be written in your consent, and this is the wording that should be used in your consent, is your participation in this research project is voluntary. Therefore, you may refuse to participate. You may also withdraw from the project at any time without giving any reason by informing the study doctor or member of the research team. Your decision to not participate in the study or to withdraw from it will have no impact on the quality of care and services to which you are otherwise entitled, or on your relationship with the study doctor or clinical team, which, like you used as an example, you don't want to feel as a participant that the quality of care will be less than if you refuse to take part in the study. And it's not even a question of once you've consented, that's it. No, consent is an ongoing process. If you decide a month down the line, a year down the line, or at any point of the research project that you wish to withdraw from the research, you can do so. So the second value that we will be visiting is that of fairness. To think about this value, you should put it in a historical context. So a good example of a research ethics scandal that occurred in 1932 to 1972 is that of the Tuskegee study on untreated syphilis. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with this case. It was pretty widespread in the news, or even in historical books of biology and such, that 600 impoverished African American men were recruited from an Alabama city called Tuskegee, and this study was in hopes of implementing, of justifying a treatment system for syphilis, which was not yet in place. And to do so, they followed participants that had syphilis or that did not have syphilis, half approximately, and did not treat them, and saw what no treatment did for them. So this was a major issue because consent was not given, and not only was consent not given, these participants weren't properly informed of the risks or even of the research at all. All they were told was that they were treated for bad blood. And in their community, bad blood was a term widely used for syphilis, yes, but also for anemia and for fatigue. So they were recruited under the promise that they'd have free medical exams regularly, meals, and burial insurance, which was very valuable for them at the time. So this was very valuable for them at the time. But what complicates the situation even more is that halfway through this experiment, penicillin was proven as a valid cure to syphilis. And this study did not provide this treatment to these patients or to these participants involved because the study was on the effect of untreated patients. And this injustice led to the 1979 Belmont Report, which is very important in the history of research ethics, the creation of Office for Human Research Protection, and various laws and regulations requiring institutional review boards. which are fundamental to research today, but back in the day they weren't. So this is what led to those fundamental acts. So as we can see, the discrimination of African American men and the impact it had on research today, we can tell how important it is to explicitly lay out in policies, in any regulation or normative document, that researchers shall not exclude on the basis of culture, of language, of religion, of race, of disability, of sexual orientation, of ethnicity, linguistic proficiency, age, gender, unless a valid reason. So giving you as an example language, let's say a participant and the researcher cannot communicate because there's a language barrier between them. The researcher has the duty to provide a mediator so that the research participant cannot be discriminated against simply because of the language barrier that they have. However, as you can tell, there are also cases where in research where it is appropriate to exclude certain groups and to really narrow in on specific groups. Like in the case of a recent study from 2017 on the Aboriginal community. So in this case, the focus, the objective, the nature, and the context of research is specific to the Aboriginal community. So in any case where a person may believe that the findings of a research study can be extrapolated to them, in those cases that person should be included. Where this study is specific to Aboriginal communities and cannot be extrapolated to any other culture, this is appropriate. However, if you go back to the Tuskegee experiment, where syphilis does not only affect African American populations, but varied cultures, varied populations, humankind in general, you cannot isolate a specific population in that case. Back in those days, it was just a question of racial discrimination and convenience and vulnerability as well. So, unfortunately, this also occurs in women. Take, for example, the treatment of coronary artery disease. So throughout the years, even all the way up until 2011 for the study, but even up until today, there is vast amounts of data gathered about male coronary artery disease, whereas there's very little said about women populations in this specific disease, but this is also seen widespread through a lot of different diseases. What do you think would be the impacts of such discrimination in research? Yes?
Well, I think it comes down to medication, that if female and male bodies are different, the medication wouldn't work the same on the women's bodies.
Absolutely.
It would work on the men's.
And having more information on men, researchers extrapolate the data to women, whereas, like you say, we're different. We have different chemistries. A scientist has said that each cell in our body has a sex. So each diseases, treatments, just chemicals interact with our cells differently than male cells. Do you have any other ideas of how this might impact? Yes?
I think it's also the case with children. They're not as included.
Yeah?
For safety reasons, of course, but we give them medication that's been tested on adult males.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would it also prioritize health concerns related specifically to men and not related to women?
Yes, absolutely. Because if you're prioritizing male recruitment, then you can't necessarily do a female-only disease. So they do focus historically. Yes? No?
Just curiosity, what do you think is the reason for this discrimination?
For the discrimination over the years?
This particular disease.
Oh, this particular disease?
Yeah.
I couldn't extrapolate why for this particular disease, and especially, this is especially shocking to me, and this is why I use this graph, because women are more, so heart diseases are the #1 killer of females in America today. So having this information, this little information on females in this specific disease, but extrapolated to just heart diseases, is very grave, because you can tell that only 1/3 of recruitment today in heart disease studies is women, and out of these studies that do indeed recruit women and report female findings, they do not dissociate their findings per gender, per sex, which doesn't help interpret, doesn't help evaluate the differences, differences in impact on both sexes.
Because particularly, it says data on women and no data on women.
Yeah.
So is it just not specifying gender, or it was all male patients?
It's both. So it's either not specifying on gender, like I said, so 31% today of findings of studies that do indeed include women in their studies don't actually assess, don't actually evaluate the impact of female-male differences on their findings.
Because this is two different
Yes,
issues,
and
right?
it also
Not
includes
indicating
studies.
the gender
Yeah.
and discriminating against the gender
Yeah.
is different,
Yeah.
right? So many of these, especially because I'm surprised about the recent years.
Yeah.
Okay, if this was.
Some would argue that not distinguishing between the two groups is still a form of discrimination.
And you don't get information about female data if
We don't
you
get information from male data as well, right? So this is.
Well, you
maybe
extrapolate
if
to
this is
humankind,
something
that's
that-
the thing. You extrapolate to the group you're assessing. However, there is value to understanding the specific impact of females, the specific impact to males, and especially when it comes to heart diseases, where you see that it's the #1 killer of females in the US today. So there would be value to finding out what influences that, and what medication can be more appropriate to them, and what treatments, and so on. But other influences are that there's a delay in advancement of knowledge in general. And
Because it's possible that there's a trend that women may refuse the research.
possibly, that's possible. I don't think they took this into account in this study, but we're just speaking generally that the historical trend we see where women are discriminated against in studies.
And one other question,
Yes.
why is it declining, the number of publications?
I think this is just extrapolated over time, and it's variable. So if you take any close subset of data, it will be variable throughout. But if you take it...
Because it's per year, and for example, 2011, we had far less
Yeah.
than 2005.
Well, you can see it's very variable.
For this particular disease, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
There might have been
Yeah,
just one
so this is like, and now, because we're talking about research ethics, this is also some form of, could be, at least I look at it with skepticism,
Yeah.
that this could be also a twist of information to get something for the particular
I understand.
purpose, especially, this doesn't seem to be.
I understand and
We should
agree.
see a different trend, and this is a surprising one,
Yeah.
and that's why I'm asking questions.
No, I understand, and it's very valid. This is a specific example, and perhaps it's not the most appropriate specific example. However, through literature, through different documents that are emitted, reports, it's commonly known that women have been discriminated, maybe not in all diseases, but...
Yeah, I do not deny this
Yeah,
fact.
no.
I'm just
No, I
particularly
understand.
curious about
Yeah.
this.
Yes, the graphic, it may also depend on the tool that they've used to do their bibliography search. So a certain number of papers will appear during certain years, depending on the tool that you're using to do your search. So it may
Yeah,
just
there's
be that.
selection criteria
Yes,
for what
the
studies they
selection
actually look at.
criteria for what
Yeah.
studies they
But it is
extract.
interesting
It
to
may
think
just
about it
be-
and actually see it
It's not
graphically.
written here, but I'm sure that if you read the article in question, they may explain their methods, and you will see why
Yeah.
there's this type of variation.
Okay.
If you want, I'm more than happy to forward
No,
the
sure.
study, or you will be getting these slides, so the reference is down there. So specifically, to avoid this problem, policy has implemented that women can't be discriminated against on the basis of gender, of sex, of reproductive capacity, pregnancy, and breastfeeding. And like you said, this risk also occurs with elderly people and children. So there's specific dispositions in the policy that state that elderly people cannot be discriminated against based on age, and same for children, adding the element of not being discriminated against based on developmental stages. So as it was for the language barrier, you have to provide reasonable accommodation. Well, with the elderly and the children, you must also provide reasonable accommodation. And this accommodation is even more important with people lacking capacity. So you can't inappropriately include them, however, you can't automatically exclude them. So people lacking capacity can only be included in research studies that when research is addressed with identified group only, where it involves no more than minimal risk without prospect of direct benefits, or involves minimal risk with prospect of direct benefits. So now moving on to the value of trust. I think it's important to put yourself in the context of research. So you are a researcher. Who do you need to establish trust relationships with when you're performing research? Other researchers, collaborators, correct? Anyone else you can think of?
Like trust as a two-way?
Yeah, as a
With
two-way
the
street,
participant?
or just a one-way street.
With the participants of the study?
Absolutely. Anyone else? They interact with so many actors.
Yeah, I would include whatever kind of organizations in the community that would want to know about your research.
Exactly. That's very pertinent, especially with Aboriginal communities, as you'll see later. Maybe the institution they're working under. Maybe also the research ethics board that approved their study. So, and also maybe professional associations, professional guidances. So all these people, you can tell that there are so many trust relationships that are established, and the same goes for institutions and research ethics boards. They establish trust relationships between themselves, with participants, with the public at large also, as they publish their knowledge. So the public has to trust them, and they would like to trust the public for receiving the data and understanding the data.
So I don't get the true meaning of trust here. Because as scientists, we are supposed to be skeptic to even the published data, right?
Yeah.
So now I don't see like if there is a definition that, especially because I realize that you're talking about research on humans, so this is not my field, but generally, could you please provide the definition for trust, and trust in what situations and...
Well, trust at large is very difficult to define, especially when you're thinking of different fields, so it may change depending on the field you're working in. However, I can give you an example that might clarify. For example, researcher, for example, a participant must trust a research ethics board to appropriately evaluate research projects, so that they are indeed, they do indeed respect research integrity, they are indeed ethical in nature, and the consent form is appropriate. So participants have important trust relationships with research ethics boards. And research ethics boards and researchers must trust research ethics board also with their research. And so that's where it's kind of an intertwined web between these actors. Some relationships are more obvious than others, but the most obvious one I can think of is that of participants with research ethics boards. Because without research ethics boards in place, it would be difficult for participants to truly know that the study has been vetted, that it has passed the ethical standards. And this is where research ethics boards come into play.
for example, another example for me is,
Yes.
when someone is misconducting research, right, and you are the co-author. So this is it trust between you and your co-author, and do you trust? So this is now trust should be defined here, or because this is also your responsibility as the co-author. You cannot only trust on your co-author verifying something once you want to publish. This should be also approved by you, and this is something that is missing in raising some difficulties. That we see that a supervisor do not follow a publication line by line, and in fact there is misconduct of research in there, and this is not caught and disclosed, and there are different. So this is why I needed some, at least we are not talking about this type of trust, right?
No.
Okay.
But that is a valid point, and it's an interesting topic, and there's actually going to be a workshop in February about authorship practices that will delve into these issues. But right now, the policy is that all authors are responsible for the content of the entire article. So they're accountable for it. And we're going to see this later with the next value, which is accountability, where accountability comes into play when there might be a lack of trust. So it's basically a participant that might not be able to trust the findings of a research study. Well, at least they can trust that if there was misconduct, there will be sanctions.
Mhm.
So it kind of supplements this notion of trust.
On that point, I think it would depend also what type of research, because for example, in genetic studies, sometimes they have sample sizes of 10,000, 20,000 people,
Yeah.
and there's over 100 collaborators on it in all different parts of the world. So they could be, I guess, held accountable for what's in the article, but I mean, they're not actually on location checking what other people are doing.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that
Yeah.
would still apply. And it
So
would break
that
down at
adds
point.
a very interesting layer to authorship practices, because you're right, there are more and more articles that are coming out with hundreds of authors on it. And yes, they are accountable for the material of the entire article, but most importantly, they're accountable to read the article before it's published. So at least having read the article and having contributed significantly, which is one of the main components of being attributed authorship, they can possibly have more of a gist of the article, even when there's 100 authors. Although I will admit there are some cases where they don't even read the article. They contribute their section and then just say, great, I'm an author. So there are very interesting ethics issues that arise with this of reality. So research ethics boards are very important to establish this trust. Like I say, let's say for the participant to trust the research that comes about. It's an ethics checkpoint, essentially. So the body of researchers, community members, and others will, with specific expertise established by an institution to review the ethical acceptability of all research involving humans conducted with the institution's jurisdiction or under its auspices. So this is the definition of a research ethics board from the TCPS2. And it's also interesting to note that there's such a thing as full research ethics board and delegated research ethics boards, which I'm sure you're familiar with that concept, but essentially full research ethics board is the default setting for any research involving human participants. However, delegated research ethics boards can be accessed with research studies that just involve minimal risk. Whereas delegated research ethics board, it's delegated people that can review the study without having to involve 10 to 15 people to review the study. And good examples of these here at McGill in the MUHC are the Faculty of Agricultural and Environment Sciences REB, Faculty of Medicine REB, and REBs 1, 2, and 3. So these are the REBs that are available to you at McGill. And to know exactly what type of research fits under each REB, you can find it on the website, which I will provide you with at the end. And MUHC REBs, Pediatrics, Clinical Trial 1, Clinical Trial 2, the Cells, Tissues, Genetics, and Qualitative Research. One is an REB I actually sit on, which is where I find that research ethics is of utmost importance to research projects. And you can see that there are a lot of issues with original research projects that have to be tailored and that have to be filtered through these research ethics board in order to provide a purely research integrity product at the end. So, as you say, yes?
What kind of training is required to be on a research board?
So there are different seats. If you want, anybody can be part of a research ethics board. There's a community seat, so it's where the community can have their input. And that's anyone who's interested in taking part in it, and you just contact the different research ethics board to see if they have room. There's also a legal seat where you need legal background, a master's, bachelor's of law. I think essentially you need to be a lawyer to be at that seat, a practicing lawyer, or at the very least have a master's of law. There are also scientific seats that assess the scientific validity of the study. So it's a very interesting organization where you really get a full review of the study in one sitting.
So there's no ethicists?
There are ethicists, so they would probably either sit on the community seat or the legal seat, depending on their training. But anyone who's involved in a research ethics board is interested in ethics. But for example, I who am interested in ethics and I'm also have a legal background, I'm the legal seat, but I do have expertise in ethics. So it provides both. But there is no ethics seat particularly, if that answers your question.
Is there any legal processes related to the McGill R&D, or they just provide some kind of consulting?
So you contact so on the website, on the McGill website, it specifically lists out what kind of projects should be addressed by specific REBs. So there are all these different REBs. So that way you tell which REB you should contact. And then once you have that REB, you can contact them and ask them about anything you want. If you have any integrity question, that is what they're there for. They're there to consult and to help you figure out how to do your project in the most ethical and integrity manner. So yes, they act in a consulting way, but also you have to, depending on the type of research project you have, you might have to have a full board research ethics approval or a delegated research ethics approval, depending on how much risk is involved in your study. Or sometimes you have research projects that don't need any research ethics approval. So you really, it's a case-by-case scenario, but you can contact them and ask them specifically. And they'll tell you, oh, you need this research ethics approval, and I know Bridget has the perfect example of this. Yeah, so it's a sometimes it can be a very long and arduous process, but the point of this is to try to make it as easy and effortless for you as possible. And I know through my research ethics board, sometimes we invite the scientist, invite the researcher to come in and explain their study, and so that we can get a better understanding of what they're setting forth as a study, and just make it easier for them and us to understand. So create that trust relationship between the research ethics board and the researcher. And you'll get all the contact information at the end of this. So, as you brought up, community engagement is also another way to promote trust relationships between the researcher and the community. So this can be done through a review and approval from former leaderships to conduct research in the community, a joint planning process with responsible agencies, commitment to a partnership formalized in a research agreement, or simply a dialogue with the advisory group expert in the customs governing the knowledge being sought. So this truly establishes an interaction between the researcher and the community, and this is enforced by the policy DCPS2 for Aboriginal communities specifically. The fourth value that is very important to research integrity is accountability. As we touched on a little at the beginning of this presentation, accountability is really a way to subsidize trust. So if ever there might be wavering trust let's say between the participant and the researcher, accountability will allow the participant to trust that if the researcher has conducted misconduct in their research study or recruitment or consent or anything of that nature, they will be held accountable for their actions and they will be sanctioned. So when a researcher signs a contract to obtain funding, to obtain a certain award, or simply employment with an institution, they are automatically signing up to comply with many guidelines and frameworks and standards that are related to those institutions. Yes?
So when they do, to do the research, I guess, or if they do get funding, not everybody gets funding.
No.
So even the ones that don't get funding are held accountable to, they have to be in agreement with these policies, correct?
Yes.
Okay, but if they don't get funding, it's not explained to them what type of agreements they have to have. How are they held accountable for something that they're
Well,
not really
for-
familiar with?
For example, at McGill,
Mhm.
and you'll see later with the specific McGill sanctions, but McGill, anyone working under the institution of McGill is held to be to comply to the regulation of misconduct. There's a regulation of proper research conduct, as I showed at the beginning of this presentation, which provide dispositions of the sort that say, here are examples of breaches to the policy, and here are examples of sanctions that you may be provided.
But how are these?
They should be informed by their employer or by their institution. However, they can also seek this information by simply Googling McGill research ethics conduct. Because yes, this is also a trust relationship between the researcher and the institution or the employer, where they should be informed of this information. But sometimes it isn't so obvious. But here at McGill, it is very easy to find the relevant, pertinent information, but you have to know to look for it. And you're right. What's interesting is a lot of people aren't even aware of the Tri-Council policy statement, which is a main guiding policy in Canada. So it is important to see the value and the importance of research ethics. So here are examples of policies that researchers might have to comply with, depending on where you're working, what institution. It's pretty exhaustive. And through these policies, as I said, there are many dispositions that are set forth, and particularly with regards to different breaches of the policy that would result in sanctions, or that would be cases of misconduct. Like you were saying at the beginning of the presentation, fabrication, falsification, destruction of research records, plagiarism, redundant publications, invalid authorship, inadequate acknowledgement, mismanagement of conflict of interest, and so on. So these different breaches will be explored later on in more detail as we discuss the sanctions that come from the breaches. You will be getting this PowerPoint. So the last value that will be looked, yes?
I just want to know that you brought about this, that every PI and every student who's going to undertake research has to do that tutorial, the DCPs.
Yeah.
But what about if you have someone from the community who's going to be part of the research, who's actually going to take part, like helping you to interview or something? They don't...
Well, they're working under some sort of funding. So they are compliant to some sort of set of policies. But I do agree this type of workshop, and we'll talk about it with promotion and prevention, is essential to any type of research, and it is something that a lot of students aren't aware of. And we actually looked into providing credits or providing some sort of certification for this workshop. So.
Just in the previous slide, if something happens, and you mentioned that there will be sanctions on the person who did, for example, plagiarism or fabrication and other stuff. Who, for example, someone graduated from McGill has already done that, and this will be identified. Who now will be responsible for imposing those sanctions?
Well,
The person, for example, informing the employer or...
Well, let's say, so we'll see this later, but to give you an example, let's say someone working at McGill notices that there has been a breach of policy or a misconduct of research, and McGill is aware of it, the institution. One of the first things they're going to do is inform the relevant parties, which include editors of the journal, which would retract the article. You know, so it's kind of like a water flow of reactions that the institution will inform the editors, who will retract the article, who will affect the researcher's reputation. So it's not just one party implementing these sanctions. It may come from many different areas.
I have a question about the conflict of interest.
Yes?
So assume that if I have published some kind of paper to the journal, and I can suggest the reviewers, can I suggest my previous advisor as reviewer, because I know he know my work, but
So you don't want me to recommend reviewers who know the work.
Yeah. It becomes tricky though when your research becomes more and more specific, and less people are experts in the
Yeah.
same field you're an expert in. So that becomes more ambiguous in those cases, but it is true that they try to steer clear from those conflicts of interest, because there are personal ties. If anything, you should at the very least inform them that there is a personal tie there, and then they will decide whether or not to allow this person to be a reviewer. So the very last value that we will be looking at today is that of openness. So as we said before, it's the notion of being transparent and making all your findings accessible to public. So how can researchers promote openness? How can institutions and RABs promote open strategies? How do you
What
think?
is REB, sorry?
Research ethics boards.
Oh.
Sorry.
I guess I stay stuck a little bit on the accountability part, because I just feel that other than our own volition of coming here and trying to learn more about this process, it is dependable on our supervisor. But I think that the openness, like it made me think of that, the institution maybe could be much more open of what is expected of us.
Yeah, that's
And
absolutely
making
true.
it mandatory perhaps,
Yeah, that's
to a
true.
certain extent.
For example, where I am now, I'm at Tenerife,
Yes.
and recently it was declared an open science environment.
Yes.
So everyone at Tenerife is supposed to be doing research that is reproducible and that is easily accessible, and all the data that we have here, it's still in the process, but will be open to any other scientists around the world.
Yeah.
So whatever code that we write is also open source. So all these things are,
And that's becoming more and more common
Yes.
amongst.
There's some journals that expect you to hand over your data set.
absolutely,
Yeah.
more
Not
and
just
more.
the article, but the data set
Yes.
itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the code that was used to calculate anything to do the analysis as well.
Well, it's happening not just in the sciences, but also in the social sciences. So there's like political science journals, and I'm from political science. And there's some really high-level ones that are starting to expect that.
Yeah, but
And
social
it's
sciences
causing a lot
is
of controversy.
Sometimes they want you to independently reproduce it also.
Yes.
So within, yeah.
To verify the
Yes.
study, yeah.
Even if trial agencies were supposed to bring up something like that about open data.
They were? Right.
Yeah, I don't know if, I think I know what you're talking about. The University of Alberta, where I did my PhD, now has an actual website, an online archive where you can deposit your studies in fulfillment of Tri-Council expectations. So if you need to have stuff open source, you can deposit it in there. And there's some journals that apparently have to let you do that if you get funding
Yes.
through, even if their own policy is not to do that. Yeah, I don't know a huge amount about it, but I know that my,
At Alberta?
at the University of Alberta's got one. I don't know if McGill's got one.
And that
But
also
it's a
brings up.
relatively new thing.
Yeah.
I think that's there. Because at least as far as I know, we haven't had any, I only saw that on the tri-agency, I think on one of their news information, but I don't think.
So now the tri-agency, if I understand correctly, they want you to make sure that at least some of your research is published in open source. But then, of course, some of that's problematic because some of these open sources want you to pay for the privilege of publishing it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, which becomes a different, like they're just shifting the barrier, like,
You're talking about like.
there's some, there's like
Publications,
PLS one
right?
or something where they expect you to pay
$3,000
few $1,000.
to $5,000 is the.
in order to make it open source so that any member of the public can search for it and access it.
But in our grant proposals
But you
right
can
now,
combine.
you can tell them that you want to dedicate the amount to
Yeah,
publish in open
yeah.
journals, so they know
Yeah,
the upside.
but if you're producing research that under a different grant
Yes.
structure, you've got to come up with the money.
Yeah.
Yeah, but even you can comply by putting it into the McGill library repositories.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's totally the
So
same
that's fine,
thing.
yeah, which is great. It'll take time, whatever embargo, but
And then there's other things like academia.edu.
yeah.
Yeah. These
Or
are all
some
good
people are
examples
posting
of open
stuff.
strategies.
Yeah.
Do you have
But-
any other examples?
So now this is, again, because I think I'm coming from a very different culture. So what is the purpose of this much of openness? For example, if you publish in a scientific journal without being open access, but many institutions have access.
But
So,
the members
and
of
in
the
fact, like,
public
there
don't.
is, pardon?
Members of the general public don't.
Right, but,
access, and that's where this part of this movement's coming from.
That's where
And
trust
a lot
comes
of
in.
these publishers too are charging a ridiculous sum of money to libraries. So we produce the research and we often do it for free because we need the publications to get the jobs.
Mhm.
And then you get some of these, and there's one company that makes billions of dollars off of this, and then they turn around and sell that data to our own universities through the journals, and they charge millions and millions of dollars of it. And it's just, it's this huge controversy now, and there's a lot of pushback. There's even some people saying that should we do peer review for free? That maybe they should give us credit so that we can get something published open source without paying.
Peer review is free. It's done on a voluntary basis.
I know that, but there's some professors who are saying that we should get something back in return for it.
Oh, that they should be paid for peer
Yes.
review.
That they should be
Okay,
paid
okay.
for it.
Okay, okay.
Because this is part of feeding into their free labor model of business for these journals that go and turn around, these publishers then charge millions of dollars for the libraries.
And also it's tax money that's going into the federal funding to do the research that's supposed to benefit the population, and then they don't have access to
Yeah.
those.
To the research.
Yeah.
So-
but my question is, we should be specific about which type of research we need this much of openness, because in fact, in part of our research, we had some industrial confidentiality. So in fact, before even publishing in a peer-reviewed journal, we had to send the data, the paper, all the results to the industrial partners, and they should have approved that, there is no the industrially confidential information within those publications, so this can be published openly.
Did any of your funding, and did any of that funding come from the government? Because
Part of
having-
it, yes,
okay.
NSEC and
But there's a
Automatic
lot of
Partnership
research
Canada.
out there that doesn't have those other kinds of ties.
Yeah.
So I'm sure the government understands that there's certain kind of corporate interests that
So
need to
there
be
is
protected.
industrial, for so that's
What
why
they're
I'm
saying is
like.
that the information can be made public, it should be made public.
Yeah.
Right.
And open science is only one example of many examples of open strategies. And this change in the tri-agency's policies is interesting to note because the TCPS2 is being revised right as we speak, and there will be a new version that comes out soon. And this also emits changes to incidental findings. So I don't know if you're aware of incidental findings in your fields of research, but it's essentially findings that you discover that are outside your research interest. And you don't know what to do with these incidental findings. And in cases of like MRIs where you find tumors where you shouldn't be finding tumors, what do you do with this information? Is it actionable? Can the participant actually do something with this finding? And are the appropriate people available to provide the findings to the
that exact situation actually happened.
Yeah.
And usually there's a neurologist on site. I mean, and you asked the participant before if there's any incidental
In the
findings they
consent,
wanna know.
absolutely. So this is the number one open strategy that's important, is just provide information necessary for informed consent. So the consent has to be as inclusive as possible to account for issues of incidental findings. What does the participant want to do with if the researcher comes across such findings? There's also, as I say, material incidental findings, conflict of interest, so institutional policies, putting forth policies of conflicts of interest. And also, in general, just having complete and accurate records of data, of methodologies, and of findings to allow verifiable and reproducible studies. So this also, openness is also important and implemented through contributions. So you should reference the contributors properly. You should include all authors that materially or conceptually contributed. You should acknowledge all contributors and contributions and understand the difference between authorship and acknowledgement to appropriately place value on the contributions that were in fact provided, and also appropriately managing conflicts of interest. So this sums up the values that implement research integrity. Now going on to the principles that are underlying in pushing forward such values. There are three main principles that you can probably gather from the values we brought forward. It's simply the importance of the person being at the center of the research. So respect for persons, concern for welfare, and justice. So these principles really push through the values to have research that is truly ethical and respects guidance of research integrity. So respect for persons has a dual moral obligation, so respect for autonomy and protection for those developing impaired and diminished autonomy, as we discussed, those who lack capacity, or children, or the elderly, to provide measures that accommodate such populations instead of simply excluding them automatically. Concern for welfare. It's not just the physical, mental, and spiritual health, but it's also physical, economic, and social circumstances of the person participating in the study. And justice goes as the obligation to treat people fairly and equitably, which you can see is underlying through all the values we saw today. So, just as it is important to provide values and principles in order to implement research integrity, it is also important to discourage, sanction the people who do have, the researchers who do misconduct through their research. So as we were talking about earlier, McGill has a set of sanctions for employees that are non-student academia or student academia through different policies. So regulations concerning the investigation of research misconduct is one regulation you can find at McGill. And also the Code of Student Conduct and Disciplinary Procedures set forth sanctions for plagiarism, for example, or various types of misconduct we previously saw with regards to accountability. So some sanctions that can be implemented are, as we spoke about before, the notification of relevant parties, which kind of waterfalls the different sanctions of retracting articles, affecting the person's reputation. So the relevant parties may be government agencies who may retract the funding that they gave you for the study, or professional societies that may retract your membership for the professional societies, or editors of journals, and et cetera, et cetera. There can be termination of employment in the case of academic staff. There can also be suspension, expelling, or failing for students who work under McGill. And also probation for lesser instances of misconduct, and unpaid non-academic activities that are enforced for, again, misconduct that isn't so severe. But at large, when journal editors are informed of such misconduct, one common reaction is the retraction of articles, and possibly the letter of apology and notice of retraction. So one study in 2012 noted that 67.4% of retractions were attributable to misconduct. And from the 67.4%, 43.4% were attributable to fraud, 14% attributable to duplicate publications, and almost 10% attributable to plagiarism. So retracted articles due to fraud can be due more specifically to submitted articles without approval, without Research Ethics Board or Institutional Research Board approvals. Like in the case of Bolt, who submitted and published 89 articles that were not, in fact, that were not stemming from research that was accepted by Research Ethics Board approval, which was mandatory for the type of research he was doing. So these 89 articles were retracted from publication. Another example of fraud is data manipulation. In Kitagawa's article, they submitted various images that were very clearly manipulated. So it was microscopy images that you can tell were manipulated and different from the actual findings they had. Yes?
So if a study is not approved by a Research Ethics Board, it's automatically considered fraud if it's published?
If your study has to be approved by Research Ethics Board. So if you look through the Tri-Council policy statement, or even just contact the consulting person involved in the Research Ethics Board of your institution, and simply ask them, hey, this is my research, should it be approved by Research Ethics Board? If they say no, it doesn't need to be, it's very minimal risk, it's not involving human participants, then you're fine. You don't need approval. But in this case, he did need approval. It was mandatory.
And was it reviewed? Like, was the protocol reviewed by Research Board after? Like, would it have been approved?
I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure if it was reviewed. Well, I'm assuming that if it was retracted, there was some unethical element. But I'm not sure what happened after this. If he went through the process and redid the studies with the approval and possibly republished later on, because that would be an ethical approach. If he wished to truly publish these findings and go through the proper passage of Research Ethics Board, then it would take more time, of course, but at least he would get his findings out there appropriately. So an example of a retracted article from duplicate publication is that of Mokhtari and Puradola, which is a case where this person submitted an article to a journal and would not get an answer back from the journal, but it was under review, so it was constantly under review. And as you all probably know, once you submit an article for review to a journal, that article can't be seen by anyone else. You can't resubmit the article to another journal, which is what this team did. They resubmitted to another article while it was under review, to another journal while it was under review by the first journal, and it got published by the second journal. So they had to retract that article because it was unethical and it was a breach of policy to resubmit the exact same article. Yes?
I've also seen instances where they'll take the same data and produce two separate articles.
Yeah.
Where it won't be exactly the same data, but it'll overlap quite a bit, and I think I've recently seen a retraction of the second article.
Yeah. So that is the second case of flat-out plagiarism. So in this case, self-plagiarism, which is what I think you're talking about, where one article that is already published, they take bits and pieces of it and publish another article with kind of a different focus.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the exact wording, but my
Okay.
understanding it was the same data.
But even if it's the same data or same concepts, it's still plagiarism if you're promoting the same information through a different article in a different journal. So this was the case with Carey et al., where they published two articles with similar information. So they kind of took information from the first article and stemmed another article off of that by keeping the same foundational elements of that first article. But there's also plagiarism of others where they didn't appropriately reference their sources and they took the information from another group. And this person, Yazdan, actually emitted a letter of apology and said that they accidentally plagiarized without referencing.
Yeah. So, in these cases, what are the policies? What are the steps?
sanctions?
Yeah.
So in these cases, they're all cases of retraction. So the articles
So
were
only with
retracted.
retraction?
All of them were retracted. So all of them were found like this. You can't read them anymore, and there's a notice that says that either is a letter of apology or that says this data was retracted because of X, Y, Z. It explains exactly the reason the article was retracted, and oftentimes it has an appendix of a letter from the author.
Okay.
And what the main influence, the main factor that is most detrimental to a researcher's career is how it affects their reputation. Having an article retracted, especially 89 articles retracted, not good for a reputation as a researcher. And there's such a thing that might be a myth, but a blacklist on journal editors that they have certain authors that they don't trust anymore. And this ties back into the trust relationship between editors and authors. You have to build your reputation so that people can trust that the content and the ethical nature of your findings.
So, particularly because I'm very curious and I came with this question here. So, first, you said 89 retractions is a bad record, and this is obvious, but who has access to this information? Once they search for the name of the person, they just see the published one, not the retractions.
Well, if you click on, if they remove it, but if you click on their name, let's say PubMed, you put their name in PubMed, it shows all the articles, and you click.
PubMed is a medicine.
Yeah, but I'm
Okay,
giving you an
so
example, but
that-
any article entry system, it doesn't retract it totally from the system. You see this. You see this.
Oh, okay.
This is what you see, which is a
Now-
big red stamp on your article.
Right. Now, I want to ask my own question. So, basically, we talked about self-plagiarism, but what if a formerly published article has multiple authors, and then one of the authors or two of the authors will basically, try to regenerate something, and this will happen. And then, basically, this is once an article has multiple authors, then one person do the misconduct, okay, and do some form of plagiarism. But then any punishment will be for all, right? So this is now like what are...
But this ties into what you were talking about earlier about the accountability for all authors.
Right.
To give their stamp of okay to the article. And I understand, especially in the more and more articles that are coming out with hundreds of authors, you can't confirm the validity of all the findings. However, you are held accountable for the content of the article that you have your name on. So you need to read the article. If you're aware of any misconduct, you need to bring that forward. And yes, you are going to be held accountable if your article is retracted, even though you're not the one that did the misconduct. But this can also be explained through the letter of the author. So as I say, when it's retracted, sometimes they'll have a letter of apology. And if it's specifically one author, you can have that author write, I take sole responsibility, or although in collaborative efforts, it's very rarely the sole responsibility of one person. You're supposed to be aware of the other's
In fact, I
work.
have a case still under,
Yeah?
so it's at the dean,
Yeah.
and in fact, one author did that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
There's definite ambiguity with this, so it's interesting to hear about these cases.
Yeah, in fact, that's a very tough one because, this was part of a very huge project.
Yeah.
This is like one person does something wrong, and then the punishment should be
Yeah.
basically focused on that particular person,
Yeah.
not not the whole group.
Yeah.
But that's just, this is my curiosity for asking.
No, that's very interesting.
I have a question about self-plagiarism.
Yes?
Just assume that I use the same data set, the same study area for a different publication for different methods,
Mm-hmm.
but in each publication I still need to introduce a study area. And then I create maybe like a map and maybe a table to list the latitude and the longitude of this study site.
Yeah?
And because I need to use in different journal with the same map, then does that count as self-plagiarism?
So it's not, there's no clear-cut definition of self-plagiarism. It's not like a maximum of 5 words in a row, you know? It would be easier that way, honestly. But you cannot write the same sentences. You can't copy-paste the context paragraph from one article to the next. However, if you do want to refer to the information from your other article, or more importantly, reuse that table, which is very valid, simply refer to the previously published article. Even if it's your name on it, even if you're sole author, you have to refer to your own work so that you can clearly stipulate this is where the information is coming from.
What I've done is, because my issue is with the methodology section, stating how, I surveyed these number of people, blah, blah. So what I've done so far is just notified them. I've asked them specifically, because there's this one where I've already got one thing published, and there's other chapter that I'm working on, and I told the people, because it's going to be through like a book, a chapter in a book.
Mhm.
So I told the publisher's editor, like there's an editor at the publishing company, I asked them specifically, and they were okay if that looked very similar, like if my methodology section looked very similar to that previous chapter. I mean, I still try to make changes, but I know I've got a couple other things I want to submit. And what I'll probably end up doing in my letters to the editors is state specifically that if you're going to find that my methodology section might read very similar to the previous work.
Mhm.
And then seek guidance from them on what they would want.
Yeah, and that's an openness strategy, which is exactly what you should be
Because there's
implementing.
only so many ways you can say, I got,
Exactly.
a response rate of X.
And also, it brings up a valid point of different editors, different journals having sometimes specific policies to their journal. Like, let's say, just referencing. How every journal would like authors to reference is sometimes different from one journal to the next.
Mhm.
Oftentimes different from one journal to the next. So it's a very good approach to actually be upfront and forward and try to ask them, how do you think I should deal with this? And that should be the same approach with any research ethics problems you may have with your study. Have the same approach with research ethics boards. I've heard so many times questions when I was sitting on the research ethics board where they were happy that the researcher asked us that question, because then we can clearly decide on what we think is the most ethical approach and how we should come about dealing with this problem, because it's ambiguous. The research ethics boards don't always have the answer right away. We have to kind of go back at the policies, try to think of the best interest of the person and come about the best strategy together. So
how about like artwork? Like if I produce a map to show the geometric location, can I use in different publication with the same artwork, or I need to refer to the previous work?
refer to previous work. Whenever you created a chart or created a table, you refer to previous work because that is a substantial contribution.
Okay.
Yes?
I just have a question.
Yes?
So in terms of the peer review process, when you send in your journal, is there a maximum allocated time that someone can review a paper?
It changes. It changes depending
On the
on
journal?
the journal. And
But there is like a time limit?
They give you a time. So let's
Okay.
say if you apply to the McGill Health Law Journal,
Yeah.
then they'll say you will get an answer within 3 months.
Okay.
So, and you can keep updated with the editor, which is what I've done on many instances, and sadly sometimes it goes over that time. So they will give you a deadline and then the reviewer doesn't get back to them, the editor. So they have to wait after the reviewer's response to give you the response.
But can they, because now I'm thinking of the the example that you gave, being able to not put it into 2 journals.
Yeah.
But for example, if you're in a small field, very specific, and it's you just maybe another a person that's in your field that you should be collaborating, but let's say hypothetically you're not collaborating, and they're your reviewer, and they have a similar study, they can sit on it until they publish theirs.
Yeah, well, that's
And that's
unethical, and we'd hope that that wouldn't
Raise
happen.
that with the editor if you think you have the reviewer on it.
Yeah.
But definitely some journals may take up to 2 years to review.
Yeah.
Oh, so that's why.
Although
it's
I do know
okay.
specific
It
cases,
depends.
I've never had it that long.
and if it is that long,
Publication.
there, you can contact,
And
for example.
pull it and pull it back?
Yes,
Okay.
you can,
That's what I
so
wanted to
it's,
know.
it's a question of
Okay.
being open and having open communications with the editor of the journal. So I know someone specifically who applied, who submitted their article to a journal and didn't get an answer within a year. And this person, these are findings and research that is going to be outdated if you wait much longer. So this person contacted specifically the editor from the journal and said, if you don't give me an answer within a month, I will retract it, and they gave her an answer.
Okay.
They were,
You can retract it, okay,
Yes.
good, that's what I wanted to know.
yes, but I mean, it depends on their policy and it depends, but it's also a question of being agreeable, and it's an understanding situation where you want it published. And if they're not gonna publish it or they don't have time to get around to it, well, you can communicate with them and say, listen, how can I retract it, or how close are you to giving me my answer? But usually they will give you a window of time where you can get an answer. So if you have any questions, any more questions? So the last slide of this presentation is essentially promotion and prevention. So as we're doing today with this specific workshop, it's important to promote good ethical practices in research. And research integrity is fundamental to research. And this promotion and prevention can be done through templates. For example, these are all the templates that are set forth by MUHC, the McGill University of Health Center. And these are all templates you can have access to when you're doing a research project and you submit your research to a research ethics board, or even if you don't need research ethics board approval, these are good templates to help you not leave off crucial elements, like I showed you in the beginning, the element of not allowing the participant to withdraw information. You know, that's a piece of information you might forget to include in your consent form, but it's specifically outlined in these templates. So these are very valuable tools. Specifically when you're applying to research ethics for research ethics board approval, we greatly appreciate it because it's easy to kind of go through and make sure that every element is on the form. There's also guidelines, policies, standards that we've gone throughout this workshop. Always consult with your research ethics board, or there's also resource people in institutions. Like here at McGill, there's a McGill Research Integrity Officer. So you'll get that contact information as well with these slides, but there are so many contact people that you can address with any question or worry you may have for your research project, and they will help navigate the obscure element that comes with research integrity and help you come about the best approach to resolving these issues. Thank you. Yes?
Go ahead.
Do you have access to these templates if you're not with the MUHC?
Yeah,
but with
they're
McGill?
publicly available. You go on the MUHC templates. And if you want, I'll add the link to those specific templates. There's also a case study, if you don't have any questions anymore. Yes?
My question is, are EPs overwhelmed? Is there like a long,
Oh, are they overwhelmed?
is there a long waiting period before they have, like, is it, there's a waiting line to look through different protocols? Or is it something that sort of happens quite, there's an external?
It happens quite fluidly, especially with the use of delegated research ethics boards, which makes the process move along faster so that you don't have to wait every month.
And are there a lot of corrections, like I know I'm being nervous, are there a lot of corrections that happen? Are the protocols really modified? Are scientists not really aware of it being unethical, because I'm sure that when they're giving you the protocol, they think it's okay.
Yeah, of course.
So is there like a high correction rate?
I'm happy you're asking all these questions. Don't ever apologize for that. There is a high correction rate, and oftentimes it's approved conditionally. So we'll give back comments, and this is another trait of openness, where we'll give back very specific comments to their protocol, their consent form, their methodologies. We'll look through all their documentation and maybe point them towards the template sometimes. Or if it's one specific thing we would like to add or remove, then we'll specifically annotate their documents with how we wish it would be changed to ensure ethical conduct.
Why do you think that is, that they don't know that it's unethical?
Well, I think there's definitely a lack of training in ethics, and sadly a lot of scientists, a lot of researchers believe that the ethical component of research is a barrier, like it's an obstacle to their research, where it should be in place to help research. Ethics is in place to not only help research advance, but help it advance with the understanding of the best interest of the participant. So.
And also, last question, I promise. So has there been a high rate of retractions in McGill? Like, do people, is there like a lot of misconduct going on, or is it generally
In like students,
Yeah.
or you're talking
In
about the Research
students and-
Ethics Board, MUHC?
in general, like I guess research, any of the
I couldn't attest to those statistics. I've never really noticed, but just with MUHC, the McGill University Health Research, it's mostly approved. It's rarely rejected, but you can tell that there are certain researchers that want one thing, but they make it seem like they want another. So let's say they want to do research, they want to create a biobank, but creating biobanks involve very complicated, not complicated, but more procedures, so more protection for the participant, more understanding of long-term influence and long-term impact on the participant, and secondary uses of the data. So there's more to consider. So they will hand us a protocol and hand us a consent form for a research study when we understand that this is in fact a biobank. So in those cases, we're going to reject it and say, please submit, like if it's a research study, tell us when you're destroying the data. If it's a biobank, submit a separate application for a biobank approval. So those are the cases that it's more ambiguous and there are more rejections when researchers try to shortcut. But in all, it's mostly conditional approvals. Because ethics, if you don't use the templates and if you don't have any training in ethics, it's difficult to envision some of these issues that may arise. It's difficult to think about withdrawal is important and telling that you will get the same health care even if you don't participate is important. But it seems obvious to a researcher, but it's important to make it clear to the participant.
Talking about your sanction slide, there was a lot about the students, and what if it's a professor who is already received tenure? What happens in this?
So it's case by case, but the McGill regulation on misconduct does say that they can provide, one of the possible sanctions is unemployment. But I think that's in cases, severe cases, but definitely they would tell the funder, so the government party or whatever funder they would have, and also the journal editor. So definitely the article would be retracted and the funder would be aware of it. But as to what McGill would do with it, it would depend on the type of misconduct, but they could go as far as to unemploy. So let's just quickly read over this case study and just hear your thoughts, and then you guys can go off. So the case study is on the value of honesty specifically. I'll read it out loud, and then we can just discuss together what we think would be the most appropriate approach. So you are a senior graduate student in Dr. Foreman's lab. You have recently completed a series of experiments primarily based on your own design. You are now ready to prepare an abstract for an upcoming meeting and a paper for publication covering the original work you have done. The abstract is due in 1 week. While examining the accumulated data, you notice that a subset of your experiments failed to respond to respond as predicted, and that there was considerable variability in results. Despite the inconsistencies observed, you are very confident that your results are correct and that your research is ready to be presented. Nevertheless, you hesitate to submit your abstract. Dr. Foreman, your supervisor, is unavailable for consultation until after the submission deadline. You wonder if you should A, omit some of the data points, B, repeat some of the experiments, delaying the publication and possibly missing the meeting, or C, go ahead with the data as is. You recognize that cleaning up data for a more aesthetically pleasing publication is common practice. So this is a situation I have seen colleagues encounter, and it's not always obvious. I mean, it might be obvious what you should do ethically, but it's not always obvious what you actually should do. If you have 1 week and you have your supervisor that's out of town, you have no one to consult, what do you do in this situation? What do you guys think?
Repeat some of the experiments.
Sorry?
Repeat some of the experiments.
And then you
Miss-
miss the meeting?
I suppose the best way would be to go ahead with data as is, and then by the time the supervisor comes back, you have time to repeat some of the experiments. And you don't have to go to this meeting, you can always retract your abstract if you see that something is very different. But more, from what I understand, they're very confident about the results. So by the time the Congress comes up, they will have time to.
And what
Clean
would
up.
they say at the Congress with this abstract?
They can keep the same data, but then their conclusions may be different.
Would they be open about
I
what
would
they
hope so,
did?
yes.
Yeah. Even though it doesn't look good.
Even
you
though
know?
it doesn't look good, you just say, well, I tried this, and unfortunately, whatever.
Wouldn't you
Just
just
say in progress and.
Yes, it's work in progress and something.
Are
Okay.
the standards different at science conferences? Because in
Some-
the social sciences, it's expected that at conferences, it's always work in progress.
Oh, no.
And if you've got data like that that doesn't quite work out, then you would be expected to provide an explanation of why you think it didn't quite work out.
In some of our conferences, they expect that it's finished work. So
Oh, okay.
you have some finished product that you're presenting. It may be work in progress when you send the abstract, but by the time you go to the conference, they expect you to have something.
And who else can you contact? The supervisor shouldn't be your only contact
No,
person.
you should contact your peers. I don't know, someone who worked in the same projects
Yeah.
around you.
Wouldn't you have a department chair or a grad chair or someone like that?
So it's important to note that you do have resource people you can
Yes.
contact. And like you said, peers also.
I think peers is because it's closer to you. You're sure that they're really working on it right now, rather than
Well, in
because
political
of the
science, I
department.
wouldn't go to like other postdocs to ask that question. I would be going to other professors.
Yes.
I would be asking, the department chair or something like that, saying, and explain my supervisor's out of town,
Ah,
this is coming up, what would you advise me to do?
Yeah.
And then if there's someone you trust, then you would take their advice. And be upfront, like you said, at the conference.
Yes.
Like for us, it depends on the conference. But I've only ever heard of one conference that expects you to have actual finished paper that's pretty much ready to go to publication. But in the social sciences, if you're ready to go to publication, you're not taking it to a conference. You're
Some of
submitting
our
it.
conferences, for example, I'm sure you go to these ones to meet
Yeah,
Guy
well,
or the
this-
IEEE meetings where they expect you to write full-size paper.
Yeah,
We write
in
one
fact,
paper
this
too, but it's still
this was
okay
my
to be-
question,
Yes.
because submitting abstracts, you
It's one
just
thing, yes.
briefly and mostly vaguely
Yes.
explain what
Yeah.
is in the results. So in fact, you can rephrase your abstracts
Yeah.
such a way that it doesn't depend highly on the
Exactly.
data under question.
But some conferences, yes.
But if
they ask.
if this is full paper,
Yes.
then there is also, this is another thing, because you have one initial submission and one final submission.
Yes.
So in fact, you have the opportunity
between,
to
yeah.
withdraw it even.
Yes.
If this changes significantly, then you withdraw it, or
Or you
publish it as a
explain,
new
yes.
result, or if this is
be
still
open about
not
it.
influence that much. You can
Yeah.
make appropriate changes, even change the title.
Yes.
And,
Well, it suggests to me then that in order to answer that question, you have to know what conference it is.
So let's
And
say,
what the
let's say the
actual culture
conference.
is of that particular kind of conference.
Yeah. But essentially, you would not present fraudulent results,
No,
so.
no.
So if
Whatever
your
the
results
conference
do
is
turn
going
out
to
to
be.
be unanticipated, as you found out by redoing this experiment, you have to present those findings.
Yes,
Yeah.
and just be open about it
And,
and just
and
explain.
have openness strategies and communicate with anyone you can talk to,
No, 'cause at
another
conferences
professor
and we
or
take stuff
the
like that,
dean.
you almost want to have that kind of data at the conference because someone else might be able to help you figure out what's going on.
Sure.
So the conference is, depending on the conference, it's an opportunity to workshop your data.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. Anything else to add? Any other questions? No? Well, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.